"Stay out of the way, ma'am. This is a military problem." He said it without looking at her. That was the part she would remember afterward. Not the words, not even the hand. The part she would remember was that he did not look at her when he said it. As though she were a piece of furniture that had somehow found its way into his communications shack. As though the idea of her being useful was so remote, so entirely outside the architecture of his thinking, that it did not even require the acknowledgement of eye contact. She sat back down. She folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. Outside the porthole glass, the Persian Gulf was the color of hammered copper in the afternoon light. The sky above it had that particular flatness that comes before chaos, a bleached, hazy stillness that experienced sailors learn to distrust. It was July. The air was thick and wet, and tasted faintly of salt and something burning, something distant and structural, the kind of smoke that comes from things that are not supposed to burn. The USS Laramie, a forward patrol vessel out of Bahrain, held her position 4 miles off the coast, her engines running at minimum power, her radio masts reaching up into that copper sky and finding nothing. Nothing. That was the word that had settled over the ship like a second layer of heat. Nothing on the primary, nothing on the secondary, nothing on the tertiary emergency channel that was supposed to be, by doctrine, the channel that always worked. The Irgish strike on NSA Bahrain had gone in 47 minutes ago, a coordinated, multi-vector attack that the after-action reports would eventually describe as tactically sophisticated, meaning it had worked, meaning the people who designed it had understood not just how to hit infrastructure, but how to make the hitting of infrastructure cascade outward into silence. The strike had severed the Laramie's primary and secondary comms links to Fifth Fleet headquarters as thoroughly and as completely as if someone had simply cut a wire with a pair of scissors. Which, in a sense, was exactly what had happened. The physics was more complicated. The effect was not. Lieutenant Commander Paul Reeves stood in the center of the comms shack and worked through his protocols with the focused intensity of a man who is beginning, for the first time in his career, to understand that intensity alone is not a solution. He was 31 years old. He had graduated top of his class at Annapolis. He had deployed twice to the Fifth Fleet AOR and had acquitted himself, by every metric that a Navy career generates, with distinction. He had a Bronze Star. He had a commendation from a Rear Admiral who did not give commendations lightly. He had never, in the precise and sequenced machinery of his professional life, encountered a protocol that did not eventually yield to persistence and training. He believed in protocols. He believed in the chain of training that connected a man's present action to his future outcome. He believed that the correct application of procedure was, functionally, the same as competence. He was about to be educated on this point. The communications suite of the Laramie was a cramped, humming room that smelled of warm electronics and recycled air and the particular plastic and ozone scent of equipment that is working hard. 4 terminals, 3 operator stations, 1 wall of rack-mounted gear that had been state-of-the-art 8 years ago and was now merely adequate. The overhead lights were the neutral, slightly greenish fluorescence of government spaces everywhere, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly unwell. Petty Officer Second Class Danny Ochoa sat at the primary station, headset on, running through the same frequency sweep he had been running for 40 minutes, his face carrying the expression of a man who is doing the right things and getting the wrong results. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb sat at the secondary station, doing the same. The 3rd terminal was unmanned. There was no one left to put at it whose presence would change the result. In the far corner of the room, away from the terminals, in the space between the rack-mounted gear and the starboard bulkhead, where there was a folding chair and a small clear floor space that was not quite large enough to be useful and not quite small enough to be ignored, a woman sat with a hard-sided equipment case across her knees. Her name was Carol Ferris. She was 53 years old. She was wearing civilian clothes, cargo pants and a moisture-wicking shirt that had seen better days, both in the muted, indeterminate color that government contractors tend toward, a kind of institutional beige that is the visual equivalent of being forgettable. She had reading glasses pushed up on top of her head, the kind with thick frames that seemed to belong to a librarian or a high school science teacher, the kind that no one associates with authority. Her badge, laminated and government issue, hung on a lanyard around her neck, and it identified her as a technical contractor for a signals consultancy whose name was 2 initials and a number, the kind of name that means something to the people who need it to mean something and nothing to everyone else. She had short gray-brown hair and a face that was weathered and calm, the face of someone who has spent a great deal of time outdoors in environments that were not kind to skin and who has long since made peace with that fact. She was not beautiful in the way that draws attention. She was not intimidating in the way that commands rooms. She was, in the vocabulary of the visible world, a middle-aged woman in a corner with a piece of carry-on luggage, and she had been treated, since she had boarded the Laramie 6 hours ago, for what was supposed to be a routine contractor inspection of the vessel's tertiary HF relay components, with the precise degree of consideration that description suggests, which is to say, very little. If you believe that the most dangerous people in any room are always the ones who need the least attention to feel powerful, type the word competence in the comments below. She had been quiet since the alert came in. She had watched Lieutenant Commander Reeves take charge of his comms shack with the crisp authority of a man executing a rehearsed plan, which he was, because all of them were. Every protocol in the book designed to handle exactly this category of problem. She had watched Ochoa sweep the frequencies. She had watched Webb work the secondary system. She had observed the shape of the silence that was building in the room, the particular texture of it, the way it was not just absence of signal, but presence of something else. A specific, engineered silence that she recognized the way a vintner recognizes a particular terroir, not just from training, but from years of immersion in a landscape until the landscape becomes part of your reading of everything. She knew what was causing the silence. She had seen this architecture before. Not here, not in these exact waters, but in an environment close enough that her body recognized it before her conscious mind had finished the analysis. The IRGs had been developing this frequency suppression capability for a long time, longer than most of the intelligence summaries she had read in the past 3 years had suggested they were capable of. They had done something elegant and infuriating. They had not simply jammed the frequencies. They had introduced a pattern of interference that was almost indistinguishable from atmospheric noise to the automatic discrimination systems that modern military comms equipment uses to filter signal from static. The equipment was, in a sense, being politely and efficiently deceived. It was being told that there was nothing to hear. And it was believing the message because the message had been carefully crafted to sound like the truth. She recognized it because she had helped design the countermeasure to it 11 years ago, in a context that no longer existed under that name. For a task force that had operated in a frequency environment that was, in the relevant technical dimensions, identical to this one. She had opened her equipment case. That was when Lieutenant Commander Reeves had told her to stay out of the way. And then, 40 seconds later, as she reached for the console to check a single frequency reading, a gesture that would have taken 4 seconds and disturbed nothing, he had placed his hand over hers and physically moved it away from the surface of the equipment. Not violently, not cruelly. The way you move a child's hand from a stove, firm and certain and without consultation, The way you handle something that you have pre-categorized as being incapable of knowing better, and therefore not requiring the courtesy of an explanation. She had looked at him then. She had looked at him with the calm gray eyes that had once held a room of 60 intelligence analysts in a subterranean facility outside of a city she was not authorized to name. In the silence that precedes a briefing that changes the operational picture of a theater of war. She had held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she had sat back down. She had folded her hands in her lap, and she had waited. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb had been in the Navy for 19 years. He had the kind of quiet, institutional knowledge that accumulates only through tenure and attention. The awareness that comes from having seen enough iterations of a thing to understand which variations matter and which do not. He had been watching Carol Ferris from his station since she opened her equipment case. Not overtly, not in the way that would register on a room scan, but watching, in the peripheral, patient way of a man who has learned that the peripheral is often where the important information lives. He had noticed the case first. It was not Navy issue, and it was not commercially off the shelf. It was built, hand-built, or assembled by someone who had taken existing components and modified them. The kind of equipment case that you see in the hands of people who have needed something specific enough that the market has not provided it, and so they have made it themselves. The latches were military grade. The foam padding inside, which he had seen briefly when she opened the lid, was precision cut to accommodate components whose silhouettes he almost recognized. Almost. They were close enough to things he had worked with, to be legible and different enough to be interesting. He had noticed her hands. Specifically, the way she had laid them on the top of the case when the lieutenant commander had spoken to her, the stillness of them, the acceptance of stillness. In his experience, there were 2 kinds of people who were capable of that quality of stillness under that quality of pressure. People who did not understand the stakes, and people who understood the stakes so completely that reaction had become, for them, an optional and often inefficient expenditure of energy. She did not look like she did not understand the stakes. In the doorway of the comms shack, leaning against the frame in a posture that was relaxed enough to be invisible to a stressed room, but present enough to miss nothing, Commodore Ellen Tran watched all of this with the expression she had spent 32 years of naval service developing, a face that revealed nothing and recorded everything. She was the senior officer aboard the Laramie by virtue of the fact that she had been conducting an unannounced operational inspection of the vessel when the alert had come in and the shooting had started, and the world had, as it has a habit of doing, declined to accommodate the schedule. She was 60 years old. She wore her rank the way old buildings wear their foundations, not as decoration, but as the thing that holds everything else up. She had said nothing since the communications went dark. She had found a position where she could observe without being in the way, and she had occupied it with the total economy of motion of someone who has learned that the most valuable thing a senior leader can do in a crisis is provide clarity about who is actually in charge, which in this case was Lieutenant Commander Reeves, and then get out of the way and watch. She was watching him run through his 3rd iteration of the primary protocol suite. She was watching the clock. She had been watching Carol Ferris. She knew Carol Ferris, not personally, not from shared assignments or common commands. She knew her the way flag officers sometimes know people who have operated at the intersection of signals intelligence and clandestine operations, long enough to become, in the relevant communities, a kind of permanent reference point, a name that other names are referenced against. She had seen Ferris's jacket 2 years ago, not the unclassified version, the other one, the one that requires a particular kind of clearance to access and a particular kind of context to understand. She had read it in the context of a briefing about signals vulnerabilities in the 5th Fleet AOR, a briefing that had made her think hard and sleep less well than usual for several weeks afterward. Carol Ferris's name had appeared in that briefing not as a subject but as a source. The person who had first identified and characterized the vulnerability profile that was, right now, silencing the Laramie. She did not say anything. She continued to watch. The lieutenant commander was now on his fourth protocol cycle. 13 minutes had passed since the comms went dark. Petty Officer Ochoa took off his headset and set it on the console. He did not do this dramatically. He did it with the flat, exhausted gesture of a man who is out of options and is acknowledging that fact without commentary. He turned in his chair and looked at the lieutenant commander, and his face said something that his voice did not need to say, because the room already knew it. Webb kept his headset on. He was still sweeping, but his sweeps had become longer and slower, the movements of a man who is being thorough out of professional discipline rather than expectation. Lieutenant Commander Reeves stood very still at the center of the room. He was, for perhaps the first time in his professional life, experiencing the specific quality of silence that is not just absence of sound, but presence of inadequacy. He had done everything right. He had executed his protocols with precision and speed, and the kind of focused command presence that his training had prepared him to exhibit, and it had made no difference. The silence was still there. The fleet was still unreachable. The ship was still dark and alone in 4 miles of copper-colored Gulf water, and whatever was happening on shore, whatever was unfolding in the smoke-threaded haze over Bahrain, was unfolding without them. He was a man whose identity was built on competence, on the alignment of training and outcome, on the confidence that the right actions, correctly executed, produce the right results. That confidence was currently being held underwater, and he could feel it struggling. It was Webb who spoke. "Sir," his voice was careful and level, "request permission to ask the contractor if she wants to try something." The room was very quiet. Reeves looked at Webb. Webb met his gaze without expression. 19 years of naval service had given him the ability to make a professional request in a way that was simultaneously a request and a statement of the obvious, without being either insubordinate or deniable. He had the face of a man who has been in enough of these rooms to know that the moment when someone needs to say the thing is usually the moment when saying it is hardest. "She's a systems inspection contractor," Reeves said. His voice was even. "She's here to look at relay components. She doesn't have operational access, and she doesn't have the clearance for the active frequent environment." "Sir," Webb said again, with the same careful, level tone. The beat of silence that followed was not comfortable. Commodore Tran straightened in the doorway. She did not step into the room. She simply changed her posture, a small movement, but in a room this small and this charged, it was enough. Every person in the room felt it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure, not consciously, but in the body. "Lieutenant Commander," she said. Her voice was quiet. It was the voice of someone who has not needed to raise it in a very long time. "Ask her." Reeves looked at the Commodore. She looked back at him with the patience of a geological feature. He looked at Webb. Webb looked at nothing in particular and waited. Reeves turned. "Miss Ferris," he said. The 2 words had the quality of something being bitten off and swallowed. "If you want to try something, go ahead." Carol Ferris looked up from her hands. She nodded once, the way you nod when the answer has been yes for the last 13 minutes and you have simply been waiting for the question. She stood. She moved to the console that Ochoa had vacated, settled into the chair with the economy of motion of someone sitting down to a task they have done 1,000 times, and opened her equipment case on the floor beside her. The contents were visible to the room now, and Webb leaned forward almost imperceptibly in his chair because what he was seeing was interesting. It was not standard. It was a hybrid relay assembly, something hand-built around an HF transceiver core that he recognized as a commercial maritime unit that had been substantially modified, mated to a component array that he did not recognize at all, connected by cabling that was color-coded in a system he had never encountered. The whole assembly was compact enough to fit in a carry-on case and looked, to the untrained eye, like a rack of complex hobby electronics. To Webb's considerably less untrained eye, it looked like something that someone had built for a very specific purpose, in the way that custom tools are built, not to impress, but to solve. She did not rush. She connected the assembly to the console's auxiliary input port with a cable from the case. She adjusted 2 settings on the handheld component, in a sequence that was smooth and automatic. Muscle memory, the movement of someone who does not need to think about the physical gesture, because the physical gesture has become part of the thinking. She put on a lightweight headset that had been coiled in the top of the case. She made one additional adjustment, a dial that she turned with 2 fingers and then stopped at a position that appeared, to the room, arbitrary, but which was the product of a calculation she had completed in her head 40 minutes ago while sitting in the folding chair with her hands folded in her lap. "This is going to sound like nothing for a few seconds," she said. "That's correct. Don't adjust anything." She was not speaking to Reeves. She was speaking to Ochoa, who was now standing behind her, and to Webb, who was watching from his station. She spoke the way a surgeon speaks during a procedure, informational, calm, directed at the people who need the information. She keyed a short burst transmission. Static. The room breathed. She keyed another burst, slightly different in its pattern, adjusting the dial by a fraction. More static. Reeves stood with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who is watching a thing he does not believe in and does not know how to stop without making the situation worse. She keyed a third burst. And then, from the headset speaker, audible to the room because the volume was set high enough to monitor without a closed ear, a sound emerged from the static. A carrier tone, thin, slightly wavering, threading through the noise the way a needle threads through fabric, but there, unmistakably there. Webb sat up straight. Ochoa made a sound that was not quite a word. Carol Ferris did not react. She was already working, her hands moving across the assembly with the kind of focus that has no room for self-congratulation, because it is entirely occupied with the task. She made 3 more adjustments. The carrier tone steadied. It stopped wavering. It locked. From something that had sounded like a thread, it became a line, and from a line, it became a channel, thin and imperfect, and carrying the hiss of its age with it, but a channel. "NSA Bahrain," she said, and her voice was the same on the transmit as it was in the room, level and focused and without performance. "NSA Bahrain, this is mobile relay contact via secondary tertiary HF. Authenticate your last." A pause that was 4 seconds and felt like 4 minutes. Then, from the speaker, through the static and the 4 miles of Persian Gulf air and the ionospheric skip that had carried the signal in a long arc over contested airspace, a voice, real, present, on the line. "Mobile relay, this is NSA Bahrain operations. Authentication confirmed. We have been attempting contact for 17 minutes. Identify vessel." The room did not explode. It did not erupt in cheers. People who have been holding their breath for 17 minutes do not explode when they exhale. They exhale, slowly, with the specific, deflating, enormous relief of muscles that have been braced against a pressure that has now lifted. Carol Ferris keyed her transmit. Bahrain, relaying from USS Laramie. Forward Patrol Sector 4. Vessel is intact. Comms were compromised by Irgic's frequency suppression, character consistent with mapped Iranian electronic warfare variant Delta 7. We are stable. Commander requests fleet guidance on current operational posture and extract authorization if applicable. Over. She said all of this the way she had said everything else, without drama, without a single wasted syllable, in the vocabulary of someone who has been having this specific category of conversation for a very long time. Commodore Tran stepped fully into the room. She was standing directly behind Carol Ferris now, close enough to lean over her shoulder and speak into the auxiliary transmit if she needed to, and her expression had changed. The geological patience was still there, but underneath it, visible now, was something that might have been, in a more demonstrative person, profound relief, and something else, something that looked, if you knew how to read her, like a kind of quiet anger, not at the Iranian strike, not at the situation, at the 17 minutes, at the folding chair in the corner, at the hand. She looked at Lieutenant Commander Reeves. He was standing against the wall of the comms shack. His arms were no longer crossed. The channel from Bahrain continued to speak. Fleet headquarters, now routing through the relay that Carol Ferris had raised, began to issue the coordinated operational picture for the sector. Extract orders, repositioning guidance, status updates on the shore situation. Real-time information that the Laramie had been blind to for 17 minutes. The information flowed through the thin HF channel that Ferris had threaded through the Irga's jamming, the way water finds a crack in concrete. Not because the crack was obvious, but because the water knew where to look. If these stories mean something to you, you can help keep them coming on Patreon. The link is right there in the description. She worked the link for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. She did not hand it off. She did not explain what she was doing in real time or offer commentary on the elegance of the solution. She simply worked it, maintaining the relay, adjusting for drift, compensating for the minor frequency oscillations that the ionospheric skip introduced, keeping the channel stable with the same steady, fine-grained attention that a musician might give to a difficult passage in performance, not thinking about the music, being the music. When the extract order had been routed, confirmed, and acknowledged, and when Fleet Headquarters had what they needed to begin coordinating the Laramie's repositioning, she keyed a final transmission. NSA Bahrain. Relay contact will remain active until vessel is in range of standard communications infrastructure. Advise against attempting to replicate this frequency profile via standard fleet comms assets. The profile is environmentally specific and will not initialize correctly from a different physical source. Acknowledge. Mobile relay, acknowledged. Good work. She keyed off. She took off the headset and set it on the console. She disconnected the assembly from the auxiliary port. She began, methodically and without haste, to replace the components in their precision-cut foam cavities. The room was silent in a completely different way now, not the silence of absence, the silence of presence, of people who are in the same room as something they have just witnessed and are still in the process of understanding. It was Webb who moved first. He stood up from his station and he said, in a voice that carried no inflection other than the flat conviction of a man stating an operational fact, "Ma'am." He was not addressing his commanding officer. He was addressing Carol Ferris. She looked up. He nodded. A single, deliberate nod. The kind that says everything it needs to say, and no more. She nodded back. Commodore Tran waited until Ferris had closed the case and latched it. Then she said, "Ms. Ferris." And when Ferris looked at her, she said, "Would you give us a moment?" It was not a question. Ferris stood, picked up her case, and stepped out of the comms shack. The door, which had no dramatic mechanism, simply swung and settled. Commodore Tran turned to look at Lieutenant Commander Reeves. She had known, in the 32 years of her naval career, a number of men whose primary professional limitation was the completeness of their confidence in the coherence of their own categories. Men who were not cruel, and were not unintelligent, and were not, in the standard metrics of evaluation, incompetent, but who had built their understanding of the world on a sorting system that was, in its architecture, exclusionary. Systems that had been built when certain people were not in certain rooms, and which had never been updated to reflect the reality of who was in the rooms now, or who had always, quietly, been capable of being in the rooms. Men who, in the specific moment when the sorting system collided with contrary evidence, did one of two things. They updated, or they doubled down. She had made it her business, when possible, to engineer the collision. "Commander Reeves," she said. He straightened. Old instinct. "I want you to tell me what you know about the contractor who just raised Bahrain." He was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was, almost nothing. The honest answer was, her badge and her company name, which he had not looked up, and the fact that she was on the vessel for a relay inspection, and, when she had reached for his console, the single fact that she was a civilian in his space during a military crisis, which had been sufficient for him to act as he had acted without requiring any further information. "Not enough," he said, finally. The two words cost him something. She could see it. She did not soften it. "No," she said, "not enough." She moved to the console, where Webb sat watching with the careful attention of a man who is very professionally minding his own business. She did not make a production of what she was about to say. She said it the way you state the known facts of a situation. Carol Ferris, Warrant Officer 1 through Chief Warrant Officer 3, United States Army Signals Intelligence. 11 years of service. Last 3 assignments: NATO SIGINT support, Eastern European Theater, clandestine communications, Joint Task Force operating in the specific frequency environment of this AOR, which she learned in a context that does not appear in her unclassified record, for a period of 2 years. And prior to separation, development of a secondary HF relay architecture specifically designed to operate invisible to the electronic warfare capabilities of the country whose jamming you just spent 17 minutes failing to get around. She let that settle. She built the gear in the case herself. She brought it on board this vessel as part of a contractor kit that nobody thought to ask about because nobody thought to ask about her. She has been sitting in that chair since 1300 hours. She has been sitting in that chair since the comms went dark, watching you run the protocols. And she waited. She waited until your executive officer asked. Because, and here Tran's voice went quieter, not softer, quieter, the volume that carries more than the shout. She has been in enough rooms to know that the moment matters less than the outcome. That saving the argument for later and saving the ship now is the correct order of operations. She has been doing this since before you were commissioned. The room was profoundly still. She asked you once, Tran said. You moved her hand. Reeves said nothing. There was nothing to say. Webb was looking at his console. Ochoa was looking at the floor. The only sound was the ambient hum of the electronics, the same hum that had been there the whole time, patient and indifferent to the human drama that had unfolded in front of it. Tran said, "You will have the opportunity to demonstrate better judgment for the remainder of your career, Commander. I suggest you take it." She paused. "That is all." She moved to the door of the comms shack. She found Carol Ferris standing in the passageway outside, equipment case in hand, her reading glasses back up on top of her head. She was looking out a porthole at the Copper Gulf. Tran stood beside her for a moment. "Your record says you separated as CW3, she said. "Yes, ma'am. It should say more." Ferris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The record says what needs to be known by the people who need to know it, ma'am. The rest doesn't serve any purpose." Tran looked at her. Ferris met her gaze with the same calm gray eyes that had looked at a junior officer's hand on hers, and calculated, correctly, that the moment was not the moment, and the argument was not the argument. "What frequency?" Tran asked, and she meant the HF waveform, the 40-year-old architecture that the Iranians had never bothered to jam because they had never seen anyone use it in an operational context, because the context in which it had last been used was the kind of context that does not appear in the summaries of the people who are building the jamming systems. "That stays with me, ma'am," Ferris said, not apologetically, as a statement of operational fact. "It's still active. If it appears in a report, the life expectancy of its usefulness drops significantly." Tran nodded slowly. "Your name will not appear in the after-action report," she said. "By your own preference." "Yes, ma'am. The link will remain unattributed." "That's correct." Another pause. "Is there anything you need?" Ferris considered this with the seriousness she appeared to bring to everything. "A decent cup of coffee would not go unappreciated, ma'am." And for the first time since the communications went dark, something that was close to amusement passed across Commodore Tran's face, brief and genuine, and quickly returned to its usual habitation. "I'll see what I can do," she said. The after-action report for the Laramie's communications blackout was filed 48 hours after the vessel made port at an alternate staging facility, the Bahrain facility being temporarily out of service for obvious reasons. It was a thorough document. It addressed the nature of the IRGS's frequency suppression architecture, which the report characterized as a Delta 7 variant of a known Iranian electronic warfare system. It addressed the failure of the primary and secondary protocols, and made specific recommendations about redundancy upgrades for the communication suites of forward patrol vessels operating in the AOR. It noted that communications with fleet headquarters had been successfully re-established via, and here the report's language became notably abstract, an auxiliary relay methodology employing a secondary HF architecture operating outside the suppression band. It attributed this success to the combined resourcefulness of the Laramie's communications team and technical support assets present aboard the vessel. Carol Ferris's name did not appear anywhere in the document. This was by her explicit and unambiguous request. The frequency profile that she had used remained unlogged. The specific waveform, 40 years old and invisible to modern Iranian electronic warfare, because it predated the entire intelligence architecture that the IRGS signal mapping program had been built on, remained exactly that, invisible. It would work again, the next time it was needed, precisely because no one who should not know about it would know about it. This was, in Carol Ferris's operational philosophy, the correct outcome. The outcome that served the purpose. The tool stays sharp by staying unused until the moment of necessity. Lieutenant Commander Paul Reeves also filed a portion of the after-action documentation, specifically the narrative section covering his command decisions during the blackout period. He filed it in his quarters, alone, at 2 in the morning, and the drafting of it took him considerably longer than such sections normally take. He wrote it 3 times. The first version was accurate, but incomplete. The second version was complete, but not entirely honest about the sequence of events. The third version was accurate, complete, and honest, and it was the version he filed, and it said what it needed to say without requiring the specificity of naming someone who had asked not to be named. He had slept, after filing it, for 4 hours. He did not sleep well. In the days and weeks that followed, As the operational situation in Bahrain normalized, and the Fifth Fleet reconstituted its communications infrastructure, and the reports were filed, and the briefings were given, and the lessons were extracted and codified, the story of the Laramie's 17 minutes began to circulate in the way that stories from forward deployments circulate, quietly, word of mouth, passed between the people who work in the spaces where these things happen. Chief Petty Officer Webb told it to 3 people. Petty Officer Ochoa told it to 2. In the specific, interconnected world of naval communications and signals intelligence, where the communities overlap in the way that small professional worlds overlap, where everyone knows at least someone who knows everyone else, the story reached the people it needed to reach. Not as a formal account, not as a briefing or a memo or an official summary. As a story, the kind that gets told over coffee in a break room at a facility that does not have a public address, or over a meal in a chow hall at a base whose name appears in no tourism material, or in the particular quiet of a late-night watch when there is nothing to monitor and the conversation drifts to the things that actually happened, as opposed to the things that the official record says happened. The story, in the telling, was simple. There was a woman in a corner with a case. The officer in charge told her to stay out of the way. 17 minutes later, she raised Bahrain in 4. The names varied in the telling, as names do. The details shifted at the edges, as details do. But the core of it, the architecture of the thing, the shape that gave it its meaning, remained consistent across every version, because the core was true in the way that the most durable stories are true, not as a report of specific verifiable events, but as an accurate account of something that happens, has always happened, will go on happening in every room where assumptions are allowed to function as credentials and volume is allowed to function as authority. The most dangerous person in the room is the one who never needs to say so. This is the lesson that the story carries. It is an old lesson. It does not become less true for being old. In fact, it becomes more true, the way old tools become more true, because time removes everything that was not essential and leaves only the shape that was always there. A system that measures competence by the confidence with which it is announced will fail at the precise moment when competence is needed most, because competence, real competence, the kind that was built through years of difficulty and failure and refinement, and the particular education that only comes from doing a hard thing in a hard place until you understand not just the procedure, but the reason behind the procedure. Real competence does not announce itself. It waits, it observes, it calculates, and when the moment comes, when the protocols have been exhausted and the silence has lasted 17 minutes, and the ship is dark, and the fleet is unreachable, and the question is no longer theoretical, it acts, in 4 minutes and 20 seconds, using a 40-year-old waveform that the enemy never thought to map because they never imagined it would still be in service. Because the people who use it are still in service. The quiet ones. The ones in the corners with the reading glasses and the equipment cases and the laminated badges. The ones who have been in enough rooms to know that the moment of vindication is not the point and never was. The ones who do not need you to know what they are. The ones for whom the work is its own sufficient acknowledgement. Carol Ferris accepted the coffee. She sat in a folding chair on the deck of the Laramie as the vessel moved toward port, and she drank it slowly, and she watched the copper gulf change color as the afternoon went on, moving through shades of gold and amber, and eventually, as the sun descended toward the horizon and the haze above Bahrain caught the last of the light and turned it into something that was both beautiful and terrible, into a deep and layered red. She did not think about the 17 minutes. She thought about the waveform, about where it might be needed next, about the specific atmospheric conditions that would make it more or less effective in different seasons in different parts of this frequency environment, about the adjustments she wanted to make to the relay assembly before the next deployment. Practical thoughts, operational thoughts. The thoughts of a person whose relationship with their work is intimate enough that the work is never entirely absent, even in the moments of rest. The coffee was mediocre. She finished it anyway. This is what old Bill knows. And what he has seen, across enough years and enough theaters and enough rooms full of people who were wrong about each other, is this. The signal that breaks through is never the one the enemy planned for. It is always the one they forgot to map. It is always the one that was built by someone who understood the problem at a level that the enemy's architects never reached. Because reaching that level requires a history that cannot be faked, and a patience that cannot be performed, and a willingness to sit in the folding chair, in the corner, with the hands folded in the lap, for 13 minutes, until the question is finally asked. The military machine depends, at every level of its operation, on people like this. Not the loudest ones, not the most decorated ones, not the most recent graduates of the most prestigious programs, not the ones whose promotions are most visible and whose confidence is most articulate. The machine depends on the ones who have been so thoroughly and completely forged by what they have done that they no longer need anything from outside themselves to know who they are. The ones whose identity does not require your recognition in order to remain stable. The ones who can sit in the corner for 13 minutes while someone tells them to stay out of the way and hold what they know in stillness and wait. They are out there. They are in every room you have ever been in that contained a problem too hard for the protocols. They are in the contractor seats and the back rows and the auxiliary positions, and they have red glasses and laminated badges and equipment cases that look like hobby electronics. And they were there before you, and they will be there after you, and what they know is not in any manual that you have the clearance to read. The hand on the console is not an intrusion. The quiet woman with the reading glasses is not a furniture piece. The person you are not looking at when you speak is sometimes the only person in the room who can save you. This is a lesson learned every generation. It has to be, because every generation has to learn it for itself, in its own folding chair, in its own 17 minutes of silence. Pay attention to the corners. For more stories where quiet competence humbles loud arrogance, subscribe to Old Bill's Tales. This channel exists to honor the ones you never heard about, the ones in the corners, the ones whose names did not appear in the report. And if you would like to help me keep telling their stories, you will find my Patreon linked in the description below. Thank you for standing with me.